Welcome to Palestine Deep Dive. And today I'm joined by the lawyer, academic and writer, Kenneth Stern. And Kenneth joins us from Brooklyn, New York. My name is Mark Seddon. I used to work for the United Nations. I was a speechwriter for the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. I used to work also for the former President of the General Assembly. But before that, I was a journalist. I worked as the UN and diplomatic correspondent for Al Jazeera Television. And prior to that, I was editor of a newspaper in Britain, which is where I am right now. Now, Kenneth is, for those of you who do not know him, a director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, which is a program of the Human Rights Project at Bard College in New York. And from 2014 to 2018, he was executive director of the Justus Karin Rosenberg Foundation. And from 1989 to 2014, he was Director of Antisemitism and Hate Studies and Extremism for the American Jewish Community. His 2020 book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate, and we're going to be discussing many of these issues connected with all of that today, examined attempts of partisans of each side to censor the other and the resulting damage to academia. And of course, very pertinent to our discussions tonight is the decision of the Kennedy School of Business, the Dean of the Kennedy School of Business, to reverse his decision to block the fellowship of our guest from last week, Kenneth Roth, formerly of the Human Rights Watch. Now, of course, our Kenneth with us this week is a long-time human rights champion, a very, very distinguished record of standing up and campaigning for the rights of others, amongst, of course, others, including the Native Americans and the homeless. So it is a great delight to have you, Kenneth. A very brave, a moral man that you are. You've been very forthright in standing up for human rights and against racism in whatever form it takes over the years. And I wondered if I might begin by asking you, actually, I mean, you know, here we are. We're in the 21st century, 2023. Certainly, when I was growing up, and when people of my age were growing up, it was 20, 30 years after the Second World War. But we were able to listen to our parents and our grandparents, those who had been active in the fight against Nazism and fascism, and really, it did seem that what they had experienced, what they had seen, had been so shocking, so appalling, and what had actually happened could never ever happen again. The Holocaust, and on top of that, essentially, you know, rational men and women could never ever be, well, of course, they wouldn't ever be attracted to anti-Semitism, but essentially anti-Semitism was a thing of the past. It was finally, after that, going to be eradicated. So I suppose my question is now, what do you make of it's a very broad question, I suppose, but you know, how virulent is anti-Semitism in our societies, particularly in America and Europe right now, would you say?
Well, first, Mark, thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion with you and your audience. You know, the way I think about anti-Semitism is, I mean, clearly you're right. I mean, the Holocaust was the logical endpoint, as horrible as it was, of where anti-Semitism could lead, and it was an object lesson. But anti-Semitism has been around, you know, for thousands of years, and you could look back at times where it was, you know, Jews being held collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, or the blood libel, the idea that Jews steal Christian children and drain their blood to make matzahs, or ideas about the plague, the Black Death, that Jews were poisoning wells, or the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the czarist forgery promoted by others, you know, including Henry Ford here, the automobile manufacturer that saw a Jewish conspiracy behind everything that went wrong in the world. So anti-Semitism is its essence a conspiracy theory, right? It's a belief that Jews conspire to harm non-Jews, and it gives an explanation for what goes wrong in the world. And you mentioned my day job as the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. I don't think one can understand anti-Semitism without looking at it in the larger framework of the human capacity to hate. It's not the only type of hatred that exists. I mean, there are certain types that are different from others in terms of how they manifest, but they're all a subset of the human capacity to how we see ourselves, how we define others, how we think of that other, and especially our capacity when we see our identities under threat, to see those others as a nefarious force, and therefore are fighting that other group that we see as a threat, we see as something noble. And we've seen that throughout history, regardless of where, regardless of when, regardless of religion, culture, economics, or any other variable. We've always had this us and them capacity to divide. There's even, in the academic world, there are even things now in brain science. You could show different parts of the brain fire differently when you show people pictures of people of different races. Not to say that that's ingrained about different races, but like who's the us and who's the them is a very quick calculation. And when that happens, we tend to want to see things in binary terms, in simple terms. We want to be certain. We want to have justice on our side and total evil on the other side. And I think anti-Semitism, plays into this human capacity. And I could talk a little bit more, if you like, about how it actually works. But to think that one horrific event like the Holocaust was going to make everybody say, we should never. The people that promote anti-Semitism see it as they're doing something noble, and they see it as they're protecting themselves. So it's still, very much of a concern. That being said, there's no single metric to define how it is at a particular time. Yeah, there are things like hate crimes, attitudes. So but there's also the pushback to it. I mean, I don't know if you followed what was happening with Kanye West here. The guy with millions and millions of followers was doing the most vile type of anti-Semitic stuff. But on the other hand, a lot of companies cut their ties with him. That shows there was a pushback to it. The second gentleman had a conference at the White House about contemporary anti-Semitism. So all these different data points are part of the picture.
I suppose this is partly what prompted my question. What you're talking about there in Kanye West and social media is how some of these tropes that most people thought sort of disappeared, gone, been forgotten. Rational people, we would not see this sort of stuff rear its ugly head again. But social media does seem to have played a massive role. Of course, not just over anti-Semitism, but racism in general, Islamophobia, all the rest of it. That seems, I suppose, axiomatic and obvious. But Has that really been part of the problem, really, in fanning the flames of a contemporary anti-Semitism, do you think, social media?
I think it has a role in it, but it's about the ideas and how the ideas fit into people's perceptions of their lives and how they view other folk. So, and social media is relatively new. There were concerns, obviously, about how hatred, including anti-Semitism, was promoted. When the printing press was invented and radio, Father Coughlin in the United States was a huge media figure using television, cable news, and so forth. So there are all these different media. So the social media, I think one of the things it does, and cable news does the same thing in the United States too, where you have a lot of people in the bucket of Fox News and Newsmax, and a lot of people in the sort of MSNBC world, that it basically allows people to believe that everybody who sees the world their way is right, and everybody else who has a different position is not only wrong, but somehow evil. There's a guy named Matt Taibbi, who's also a Bard alum, who wrote a book about cable news. And his basic premise was that instead of saying, here's a complicated problem that we all have a hand in creating, that we all should have a hand in solving, it's complex. The answer instead is it's a simple problem and it's their fault. And they build ratings and monetize it. And I think social media, does the same thing to a degree too. One of the things that drives my wife nuts is a few years ago, I said to her, we get most of our news from CNN and MSNBC. I got to watch a lot of Fox News and Newsmax. And I do the same sort of equivalent online. And she said, how could you do that? And I said, how could I not? There are millions of people who see the world this way. So I think just as a understanding of how the world works, to see how people have an internal system of thought that may be fundamentally different, and crossing those bridges and finding ways to see those other buckets is important.
It's kind of silos, isn't it? I mean, just as when I've been living and working in America, watching, I used to try and watch as many channels as possible, and it did strike me that there was an awful lot of opinion leading the different networks, and not a fantastic amount of reporting or analysis, which can't exactly help the kind of silo mentality. But mind you, this is a phenomenon that's happening in media all over the world, and people seem to be attracted to where they feel comfortable. And if they're all writing green ink, well, everybody else who doesn't write in green ink must be mad. But look, Kenneth, if I could just return to actually one of quite a famous article by you, Holocaust Education Alone Won't Stop Hate. That's what its title was. You actually proposed some ways to combat what we've just been talking about, persistent anti-Semitism. And there were 3 specific suggestions. I wonder if you might briefly address each of them. You said human rights organizations must be challenged when they don't sufficiently assert the freedom from anti-Semitism as a human right. So when you wrote that, did you have any particular human rights groups in mind? Or was this really a call for all organizations to be rather more aware and to kind of step up to the plate?
Well, it was, mostly to get groups to think about what anti-Semitism is and to see it in a human rights framework. But the larger reason why I wrote that was something that also plays today in terms of I know you want to talk about the IHRA definition, but it's very much the same type of observation. Because what I was seeing that was frustrating me was the sort of general attitude of, again, looking for simple answers to complicated problems. It was to say, whenever you saw anti-Semitism, the silver bullet, the one solution, the one thing to do was to provide Holocaust education. And again, to me, Holocaust education is important. I serve on a committee that I'm honored to serve on at the Holocaust Museum from Washington, D.C. I'm not diminishing it as something that I think is an important piece of history for people to know about and to really grapple with. But to think that somehow understanding that is going to be a cure-all for all different types of anti-Semitism makes no sense. I mean, there was this was written not too long after the period of the Second Intifada, and we started seeing attacks on Jews in the outskirts of Paris and so forth. And some of the attackers were people that were young Arab and Muslim students who were getting, seeing pictures of Israeli soldiers with guns lording over their co-religionists, and we're hearing things about Jews from satellite television. Back then was the big thing, not social media, and some of their imams. And you think really teaching them about what happened at Wannsee is going to get them to change their view of what they think about Jews and associating that with Israelis. So there was a lot of just sort of wishful thinking and sort of bromides that made me concerned about, that's a piece of the puzzle, but to say that's all we have to do. And as I put in that article, there were attacks on Jews in Sweden, for example, that clearly were being motivated by some of the concerns about things in the Middle East. And the U.S. State Department put out a report praising Sweden for what it was doing about Holocaust education, which it was a total, mismatch. So that was what I was trying to do, to get people to think simple answers not going to happen. Same thing we're seeing now, and that's why, with the debate about the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, rather than really think about what drives anti-Semitism today, and I can talk more about that, if you'd like. Let's just have as many places as possible adopt this definition, and that's going to somehow solve the problem. Again, it's a simple solution, and simple solutions don't work well, in my opinion.
Yes. There's certainly an argument. We'll get onto this, because there's certainly an argument to say sometimes it can actually be counterproductive, because the people who then administer the response, if you like, very often don't understand it themselves, and all sorts of other things can happen that all go horribly wrong. But it seems, I think, to many people, that this idea that you can blame a people, whoever they may be, on the basis of a government's actions from somewhere else in the world is simply untenable and wrong. And that seems to be a very powerful argument. I just wanted the other, also in that piece that you wrote, you partly answered it just then, because you said governments must be engaged to ensure that they investigate and prosecute anti-Semitic hate crimes fully, and simply having a code or an education program isn't going to be enough. So what do you think governments are now doing more of what they should be doing, and what is it they're doing that is right?
Well, it depends on the governments where, and I think that there's a need for governments, obviously, to think clearly about what hate crimes are and anti-Semitic ones, and that was, again, one of the sad aspects of the whole debate about the IHRA definition, is that, which, by the way, was written in 2004, 2005. To me, a key part of it was to think about hate crimes, because you may recall that there were, all sorts of debates. There were debates about if a Jew was attacked because somebody was upset with an Israeli action, is that something that should be counted as an anti-Semitic incident? There were questions about, Jews being kidnapped, and, well, that's a positive stereotype. So Jews are rich, so is that an anti-Semitic incident? And I was taking some of the best knowledge from American hate crime law thinking, and trying to create clear language that said, no, it doesn't matter what a person really thinks about a Jewish person. It doesn't really matter if it's because somebody's upset with an Israeli. The parallel to me was like, if you look back in the South in the 50s and 60s, if a black person was hung up by a tree and lynched because somebody thought blacks were shiftless and lazy, that was racism. But if they were upset with passage of the Civil Rights Action or Martin Luther King's speech, that wasn't. So you have to look at the selection of a person because of who they are or who they're associated with as the cornerstone of what a hate crime is. And, I think that the sort of understanding that was one of the keys for driving the idea of having the definition promoted. And that's being lost in the entire debate about how it's being used about speech about Israel, as opposed to saying, let's look at not necessarily the motive that somebody attacked somebody, but the intent to make an illegal selection. And I think the more that we can focus that and take away from trying to psychoanalyzing the perpetrators and looking at the intent to make an illegal selection, the better off we'll be in thinking about hate crimes writ large and anti-Semitic ones in particular.
Well, you have been quite clear, because you have said monitoring groups must catalogue not only the old-fashioned forms of religious and racial anti-Semitism, but also the more contemporary forms that treat the Jewish state in the same bigoted manner that traditional anti-Semitism regards the individual Jew. And campus administrations need to uphold the highest academic standards and make certain that while heated debate is encouraged, intimidation is prohibited. But I'm wondering whether what you say there is a more contemporary form of anti-Semitism, which is, which is sometimes confused with criticism of the Jewish state. And is that the bit that is confusing, really, with labeling critics of Israel, well, particularly Israel's human rights record, or what the UN, other Amnesty, B'Tselem, other organizations have actually taught policies of apartheid, Israeli policies of apartheid?
Yeah, it's much more layered issue, right? So there's, there are clear instances where you can bring Israel into the picture, and it's anti-Semitic. And we just talked about one. You hold Jews collectively responsible. You beat up the Jew in front of you because you don't like what Israel is doing. Anti-Semitism, not a question. You take the historic tropes about Jews, again, conspiracy theory and explaining what goes wrong in the world, and cut and paste it and substitute Israel or Zionist for Jews in that way. Yeah, that's a problem. The flip side of it is that, and this is when I teach, I encourage my students, you have to have intellectual curiosity and, empathy to imagine that you were born into a different circumstance. So if you were a Palestinian that for whom Zionism and the creation of an Israeli state was a thing that was really tragic for you, you're not opposing Zionism or Israel because it's Jewish. You're doing it because of the impact on you in two perhaps irreconcilable narratives. And there's a whole bunch of gray space between those things. And there's also inside the Jewish community too, this is playing out as well. I mean, I'm a Zionist. I believe in Israel's right to exist. I could explain more why I do if you're interested, but that's part of my view of the world and my Jewish identity. There are Jews for whom that's not the case. There are, very Orthodox groups like the Satmar for whom having a state is something you can't do before the Messiah comes. And there are many younger Jews in particular for whom their understanding of Judaism and how you treat the stranger or repairing the world can't be squared with what they see in terms of either Israel's actions or even, its existence as a Jewish state. And as much as I might disagree with them, and as much as I might say, listen, the logical implication of what you're saying is, that it preordains potentially a lot of bloodshed because Israeli Jews are never going to give up the right to have their self-determination as a haven for Jews, which you were mentioning, the Holocaust and the aftermath, the connection of Jews historically going back thousands of years to the land, the fact that the names of cities there are not New London, New Berlin, New Baghdad, but names in the biblical times. All those things, come together, as a part of the puzzle. So, there are lots of ways to be critical of Israel, but not every type of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that's, I think, is part of the battle that we're seeing inside the Jewish community. Do you have to have a particular view to be inside the tent? So it's a church-state issue here when people are trying to legislate that there's a particular view that wins.
If I may, this is what I was intrigued about, really, because we do have a situation where there's a multitude of different opinions within the Jewish community. Sometimes you come across people who say, well, one of the best ways to seriously tackle anti-Semitism is to really push for that kind of secular state of Israel, Palestine, where all religions are equal, all human rights are equal. It's immaterial what religion you have, but that is a way, you see, because I mean, you talked about the Jewish state there. I mean, does that for you mean that essentially you acknowledge that state has to be a kind of a theocracy, a bit, because the Iran is described as an Islamic state. Of course, it has, as you know, reserved places in the marginally for religious minorities. But I mean, it's still a theocracy. I mean, are you saying that effectively Israel is a theocracy, or should become one, or would you agree that actually, if it was actually what is supposed to be in many ways a secular democracy, you might avoid it might avoid some of the criticism that it gets?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I mean,
A lot.
look,
Yeah.
in my view, Israel has this tension, and it has a tension between wanting to be a democracy and wanting to maintain a Jewish demographic and therefore, political majority. And it also has the complexities of you have within the boundaries of, the state pre-67, between 48 and 67, you have a significant non-Jewish minority, Palestinian, Arab, for the most part, and you also have millions in the land that Israel controls in the West Bank. How that's going to be resolved, I don't know. I know there are people that talk about confederation, other models. My view, and I could easily be wrong, is that the only way you don't have perpetual conflict preordained, and the sort of like the best solution of all the bad ones, is to have two states where people can feel that they're controlling their own destiny. But again, while however that's working out, what I see is the problem when people think about anti-Semitism is so much of the discussion is being driven around the Israel-related issues. Whereas to me, especially sitting in the United States and having just come through the period of the Trump presidency, not that anti-Semitism didn't exist well before Trump, but I see anti-Semitism again as conspiracy theory. So one of the things that says to me about how you look at it is you don't necessarily limit your inquiry to what people are saying about Jews, right? So you have the ability to make people more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking when you have drivers that tell people that even these other groups, Muslims or immigrants, you name it, are evil and have to be combated. Because if you look, I mean, I'll share with you a metaphor that to me was brilliant back at the time of the militia movement. I wrote a book about the Oklahoma City bombing. There was a colleague who was working in Montana, which was one of the ground zero places for the militia movement. And he described the militias as a funnel moving through space. So what he meant by that is that people got sucked into the lip of the funnel by mainstream ideas. Here it was gun control and land use and federal land and so forth. Inside that system, we were talking about that before with social media and the buckets and the silos. Inside that system, people get exposed to conspiratorial thinking, and whenever that happens, it's inevitable that you get exposed to the anti-Semitic conspiracies, and out of the small end come people like the Oklahoma City bombers. And what's interesting about that to me, it says if you're thinking about anti-Semitism, don't focus so much on the small end of the funnel. Think of the drivers of the big end of the funnel. So the more people, leaders, and others are pushing people into conspiratorial thinking, that to me is more, going to be an indication of that. And just look at the Tree of Life, attack here, right? The synagogue where 11 Jews were killed. What was the precursor to it? It was Trump and others talking about invaders coming over the southern border. And the synagogue had hosted a group on immigration, and the guy shot Jews. You see that as anti-Semitism. The shooting at the Walmart of Mexicans and Mexican Americans a couple of months later, nobody would say was anti-Semitic, but the two shooters had the same ideology. They just chose different targets. So my point is to look broader, look at the social things that are driving people to anti-Semitic thinking.
In doing that, and looking more broadly, Kenneth, because anti-Semitism, racism of all forms, there's a commonality behind so much of this hatred, as you've been outlining to us. So people will turn around and they'll say, okay, well, Kenneth was a key figure, behind the IHRA definition, but why isn't there a definition for those at the sharp end of other forms of racism? Or should we just not be trying to simplify things and make it very clear that all forms of racism are totally unacceptable, and this is essentially a code for all racisms wherever they occur, whether it's there's a racism against a Catholic person, or a Muslim, or a Jew, or an old socialist. What should there not be some kind of? Well, I mean, that's a rather flippant point, actually. But shouldn't there be some kind of that some special code for against racism per se, right across the board?
Well, I agree with your basic premise that when we see other people in a way that we have prejudice, we discriminate, we harass, we marginalize, we say they're not fabrics of the society. Those are all things that we should push against. The challenge that I've seen, though, is that the twofold. One is that with the definition was created looking back in time at really in 2004 and 2005. It was called the working definition, or the EUMC definition. It got basically adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. But it was a tool primarily to help data collectors to take a temperature. So it wasn't to cut and paste a thing to stop speech. It certainly wasn't to say in a place like a college campus, here's speech, it's okay, here's not. Let's do groupthink. I mean, talk about McCarthyism. That's as opposed to saying, how do you feel about these issues and what do you think about them? What are the contradictions? It's not to simplify thinking. What it was mostly for was there was a report that came out in 2004 by the EUMC, and they had a couple of points to it about attacks on Jews across Europe. One was, wait a minute, we don't have a common set of references for our data collectors to use across different parts of Europe, and that would be helpful. And they said, in the interim, let's just say anti-Semitism is manifested as a series of stereotypes about Jews. And then they try to qualify, well, the Jews attacked not because somebody took these stereotypes, put them on Israelis, put them back on the Jew in Paris and beat them up because they were upset at Israeli policy. That's lamentable, but not anti-Semitism. So, the thing was created to try to create an understanding, as I was explaining before, about what a hate crime was, and also to give the bean counters some guidance. But what it's been used for, and I would never recommend this for any other type of hatred, is to say, okay, let's stop trying to say whether it's in the gray area, this area, that area. Let's just have a simple sort of like a Hogwarts sorting hat to say, is it this, is that? Should we, condemn it, or should we say it's okay? And that to me is especially dangerous when it's trying to be incorporated into law. So, to teach about it, there are like 3 different definitions floating around, probably more. I use them when I teach. It's good to get, people looking at a subject from different things. But especially when you have political examples, that's a problem. And when I, testify in front of
politicians try to pluck solutions. And if someone very clever comes along and seems to do their job for them, that can become, this is without, they don't, a lot of politicians, as you know, don't do a great deal of thinking. They look for instant remedies, and they think, we'll tick this box, it's all done. But look, there's a question that Omar has got. This
Sure.
is actually referring back to a previous question and answer we just had. But Omar in London says, as you say, with Zionism, by its definition, being intrinsically tied to concern over demographics, with it aiming to establish and maintain a state with a majority of Jews, reducing Palestinians to a demographic problem in their own land must surely be a racist ideology. What would you say to that?
I would say that there's, again, it's not as simple as that. I understand from a Palestinian perspective why the whole idea of Zionism is problematic. From a Zionist perspective, this is self-determination in a Jewish homeland. There's two different narratives and two different perspectives and two different types of ability to live lives is perhaps in perpetual conflict. Absolutely. But the idea of, again, the Jewish story is one of connection to the land, of temples around the world face towards Jerusalem, the poetry, and to give you just why this is complicated. I have a couplet in my book which I think encapsulates it. I have I cite a letter from the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel to a group of American Indians in Canada and New York State, the Iroquois Confederacy, basically saying to these folks who were, these folks had lacrosse as their major sport. It's very important to them culturally in the world lacrosse, something where there was going to happen in Israel. And they said, don't come. Like us, you're, indigenous folks, you're, be traitorous to us. You've had your land stolen. You've been a victim of settler colonialism. Don't come. And then I contrast that with a piece from Judea Pearl, who was the father of Daniel Pearl, the journalist who was beheaded by terrorists. And he said, for those who say Israel is a settler colonialist state, name me another place where, in folklore for generations, Jews have been connected, where, again, not naming places, New London, New whatever, that really underscores the connection, the historic connection, the yearning for the land, the importance to Jewish identity. And then I quote a scholar who says that, in some ways, Israel is a settler colonial state, and you have to look at it that way. And in some ways, it's not. And the people that push one line or the other in totality are really engaging in communal advocacy. And from his point of view, as a real historian, has to navigate all these complexities. And I would agree with that scholar.
Right. So, looking at the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism you were the author of, you have, in recent years expressed some concern that it is being used by some people essentially to try and silence serious critics of Israeli policies in the occupied territories. And I think you said, in 2019, you were quite concerned that various right-wing Jewish groups and governments were using that definition to silence people that you regard as being legitimate, critics of Israel. So, in practice, how is this happening, and what can be done about it? Because we have just by chance this evening learned the news about Kenneth Roth, the former director of Human Rights Watch. You know him, Kenneth, and he was on our show last week. His fellowship at the Kennedy School of Business has been restored. He's going to take it up now. He had been blocked. And Kenneth was fairly convinced, as were a lot of people, it's because some people close to the dean of the university essentially said that Human Rights Watch had been far too critical of Israel. So that was really seen as kind of a silencing of somebody who's not just been critical of Israel and human rights, but human rights abuses wherever they've taken place across the world. And there've been a lot of academic studies, as you know, into the work of Human Rights Watch. It's possibly because Human Rights Watch has been so effective that blocking Kenneth Stern for some was seen as such a successful move. But is the Kenneth Roth example, I suppose, one of the most obvious examples of how this is being abused in a way? I mean, what do you think?
Well, again, Ken Roth said that the dean got pressure, or it was, but it's unclear from whom and how that happened. But but it's not the only instance where there's a University of Toronto situation, a University of Washington situation. There have been other situations, but here's sort of the trajectory of what I've seen and what my concerns are. Again, when I was the lead drafter of the definition, it was primarily so that we could have an instrument to take temperature over time and across borders. And there were examples about Israel put into it because we were seeing whenever there were instances of fighting in the Middle East and certain type of verbiage in the press, there was a correlation. I wouldn't say a causation, but they're almost like graphs you could superimpose over each other of attacks on Jews in the streets of London and streets of Paris. So it was a data point. It wasn't to use as a sort of a blunt instrument to label anybody an anti-Semite. But what I started seeing, so remember, this is 2005, UMC adopts it. Flip forward to 2010. And I first started seeing this problem on American campuses. What happened was there was a 1964 Civil Rights Act in the United States that applies to campuses, and universities can lose their funding if there's a pervasive hostile environment to people on the basis of race and other things, but it didn't include religion. So the Department of Education said Jews and Sikhs and Muslims are protected as ethnicities. I thought, great. I actually brought a complaint for some high school students. There was a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas, and we used it as a way to have the school administration that wasn't doing hardly a damn thing to actually do something. But what happened is you had some of these, pro-Israel, strongly on the right groups, Zionist Organization of America and others, had this idea of, let's take this new power that we have to threaten lawsuits, and let's do that and include in the lawsuits. I mean, some of them did talk about some things that were, like spitting and actions and so forth, but they were replete with examples like they're teaching a class and using this text, which we find violates the definition. There's a speaker that's coming that's saying things that's violating the definition. They were using purely academic things on the campus to make these Title VI cases. And when those cases failed, one of the proponents said, well, at least we're chilling this type of speech. And then they tried to get Congress to pass it, and they got the president to sign the executive order. And now you're seeing pushes all over the place to get it adopted. Now, again, they will say it's ubiquitous. It's not. It's a small percentage of places. But, they're trying to use it. Clearly, the only thing that it's substantially being used for is to go after speech that people don't like about Israel, including anti-Zionist speech. And particularly on a campus, other places too, but particularly on a campus, you have to engage ideas. When you say that certain ideas are not okay, that's a problem. And as I mentioned before, there's just a church-state issue here too, deciding an internal Jewish communal question.
I think it's certainly the case in many British academic institutions now. There's actually a fear of discussing issues around the Middle East, for instance. If there's an invitation to an ambassador from Palestine or Israel, people get very nervous about it. There are also all sorts of various trigger points are set off. There's been, as you probably know, a lot of pressure on British universities to adopt the definition, including my own down the road, which is quite interesting because it's historically had a very close connection with the British Conservative Party, but also primarily too with traditions of free speech, and so it is actually one of the small number of universities that's actually quietly kicking this into the touch, because it's very concerned that for the reasons that you've just been talking about, essentially, the definition can and has been abused to try and really stop free speech. There's a question, if it's all right, if you're taking from Gemma in Yorkshire, in Northern England. She sent an email in. She says, along with the calls for public bodies such as universities to adopt the IHRA definition, students and academics, especially Palestinians, have faced what they argue are increasing campaigns of intimidation and attacks against their free speech using this definition. So how can we combat this to ensure that Palestinians and their supporters are not silenced over their criticism of Israel at universities and elsewhere? How do you think this could be done?
Well, I think there are lots of ways. One is, again, to talk about what the academy should be, right? The academy should be a place where, ideas are looked at, students are forced to feel uncomfortable, and to have their thinking disturbed, and then to think about how they're going to resolve these conflicts, because they're going to live as adults once they leave university for the rest of their lives. And the last thing you want to do is encourage some sort of groupthink, and to punish people for saying. I'm not saying not to oppose things that you find maybe bigoted or you disagree with, and to speak out about it and try to counter it. I'm saying you don't want to use levers of trying to chill and suppress to get administrators to have to weigh in, on things. And it's a matter of good teaching. So I think that's one thing, is to understand this, the reason that the university exists. Is one of the reasons too that I've been outspoken against academic boycotts of Israel, because ideas should be looked at on the basis of their merit, not on the nationality. And I think, again, we started out this conversation with talking about both sides are trying to chill speech on the other side, and I see that in both directions. And the commonality is to speak up for academic freedom, to speak up for free speech. And I think it's important to try to push back when universities are being told to adopt this. And the challenge is that I've heard some people say it's only about trying to silence, is pro-Israel speech. The people that are pushing it, some of them may be doing that, but there's also, from their point of view, we have to stick up for Jewish students. Jewish students are hearing things that they don't like. And my response is, if they don't like it, I understand it. Help them understand what's going on. Help them create environments on a campus where people can have difficult discussions. I outline in my book, in the last chapter, classes that can do this, things that universities should be doing, to create an environment that encourages people to disagree, and gives them the tools to do that. So there are a lot of different aspects of it. But again, and I think the Jewish community should step up. One of the things that's discouraging is that I've seen the sort of mainstream Jewish groups jump on this IHRA is going to cure all bandwagon, and that's like a black hole. It sucks away from the other types of things. And to give you one example, to me that's particularly heartbreaking. It was Canadian. There was a question about whether a particular school district should adopt and apply the IHRA definition. And there was a 15-year-old girl who was describing the harassment and bullying she was experiencing as a Jew. She was having coins thrown at her. She was, things like that. And her testimony before the school group was the only way you could solve this was adopting IHRA. Now, I didn't put, throwing pennies as part of the tick, for the bean counters, but to think that this is the one thing that's going to solve anti-Semitism, as opposed to talking about how do you deal with bullying? How do you create respect for each other? How do you tell on a campus you have to look out for each other? That doesn't mean to suppress speech. That means to really engage with each other honestly.
As you say that, I'm thinking back to 2017 and the General Assembly, and I think that was shortly after the attack on the synagogue that you mentioned, the Tree of Life synagogue, and the General Assembly held an event with Jewish communities, but it was multi-denominational. Actually, it was a very, very, very powerful event. It's got a lot of media attention, and in a way, it seemed to me really rather more impactful than, for instance, what we are hearing now at the General Assembly, which is that Hungary currently has the presidency, Israel has the deputy presidency. And they're very keen, Israel, and there may well be Hungarian support for it, I don't know, but to have the General Assembly adopt the IHRA definition. Now, I suppose that poses another point. I mean, this catch-all, definition that you've identified problems with, when it is that catch-all, then becomes a lightning conductor and very, very divisive. Do you think that is a sensible thing to be happening in the General Assembly now, to try and get the
Well,
UN to adopt it?
yeah, listen, I'm not an expert on the UN and what the implications of everything it does, but I've seen from the time that the definition was created with its specific intended uses, how it's been used as a way, like a hate speech code,
Mm,
and
mm,
it's disheartening for me because I mean I've seen this playing out. There's a situation that's going to develop at a legal association in the United States where this is being debated. And what I've said is, look, you're dividing people who should be concerned about anti-Semitism into this battle over people that have one view of Israel and another. And to me, politically, when you want to push back against anti-Semitism, which again I see on the right and the left, I see it as conspiracy theory. When you're telling a bunch of people who have concerns about anti-Semitism, but they also have concerns about free speech, and they also have concerns about academic freedom, that there, as one person wrote, they're basically no different than Kanye West. That's a stupid way to try to organize against anti-Semitism. What you want to do is build a bigger tent. Now, are there questions about inside the Jewish community and elsewhere about those who are totally anti-Zionist, whether is that view, do people consider that anti-Semitic or not? I don't. I know people who do, and I explain why I don't. But to then have that become the major fulcrum, makes
mm.
no sense in terms of
Well,
organizing against
if
it.
I may, you can have that debate in a community. You can have that debate per se, of course, but we have a situation. This is by the way, sadly, we've probably got only time for another couple of questions. But one question, and this is very much a sort of in a British political context. I mean, you may be familiar with the British Labour Party and the way that issues around anti-Semitism have become a very serious bone of contention within the political class, the media, and all the rest of it, which for many of us who grew up in the Labour Party always seemed rather surprising in a way, because the Labour Party or the left, wherever you were in the world, tended to be the last place in the social democratic left where anti-Semites or racists might gather. It seemed bizarre that people would be attracted, but nonetheless, there was a big issue around anti-Semitism and how it was dealt with in the Labour Party. But we have a contemporary situation, and I raise this because I spoke to a prominent Jewish member of the Labour Party here just the other day, who is part of an organisation called Jewish Voice for Labour, and she told me that, and by the way, this was all borne out by the research, very careful research that they've done, that there are about 2,500 members of the British Labour Party, apparently, but there are currently some 59 of whom have been suspended or expelled from the British Labour Party. And essentially, all of them have been accused in one way or another of being anti-Semitic. And this is a very difficult thing for many people to try and get their heads around, not least of all for those Jewish members of the Labour Party that have been treated in this manner. And essentially, it would appear that we have this blunt instrument. We have people who are in charge of disciplinary processes saying, "Oh, well, if you're critical of Israel, if you're critical of Zionism in the way that you've just been talking about, that somehow makes you an anti-Semite." Now, how can you be a secular Jewish socialist, critical of Israel, and be an anti-Semite? It doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Well, again, you put your finger on a fact that that this is a deep controversy, and there have been again, I haven't followed those 59 cases, and as an old trial lawyer, I know not to speculate on the individual things in cases, but
Yeah.
I will say I remember some of the reports coming out before, and there were certainly instances where there were Jewish MPs who were getting some really vile, clearly anti-Semitic stuff, including death threats and being called names that were, just really horrible and clearly an indication of anti-Semitism. But what was really interesting in that report that I'm thinking about is there's a push to say apply IHRA to it. And the instances that were seen as violations of members' sort of human rights in a sense by anti-Semitism that they witnessed was found under the Equalities Act. So you didn't need this extra sort of blunt instrument to look at that. Just in the United States, I mean, the Kanye West thing. I didn't hear any of these folks that are making the claim you can't understand anti-Semitism. It's been around for 2,000 years, but you can't understand it unless you use the definition. I didn't see any of these folks, many of whom correctly called out Kanye West's anti-Semitism, said that you needed to use a definition for that. So it's only about the matter of pro-Palestinian speech, or primarily about that people are using it as a blunt instrument.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, Kenneth. One last question, if you're willing, and this
Sure.
is actually from Sam in New York, where you are, and Sam asks, what does Kenneth think of the Jerusalem Declaration of Antisemitism? Perhaps you could tell us something about it, because I don't know about it. Sure. Newly launched initiatives like the Diaspora Alliance have adopted it as something of a guiding principle for them. But Israel's most right-wing supporters are vehemently opposed to it. Does Kenneth think that the JDA is a better substitute? Can you tell us something about it?
Sure, and there are others as well. There's a Nexus definition. There's a group that came out of USC that now actually has a home at Bard. We don't endorse it, but it's a different definition. The Jerusalem definition was put together by a bunch of Jewish studies and scholars and Jewish historians. And the reason why both of these came together, and there's another one, Independent Jewish Voices in Canada, is that they saw the problem with the abuse of the IHRA definition in terms of speech. And the reason that academics were very concerned about it was precisely the things that I was talking about, that they're worried about these groups are going to come and look for what's being taught, what's being assigned, and threaten lawsuits. So what they thought is the answer is, let's have another definition that that doesn't have the capacity to be abused this way. And I think that each of them has the Nexus and the JDA are better in one way. They're less likely to be abused over the Israel-Palestine divide. Neither of them have language as good as what's now the IHRA on anti-Semitic hate crimes, but they all have the core of what anti-Semitism is, reflected in different words, but the basic idea that I started off with, anti-Semitism, is conspiracy theory, believing that Jews conspire to harm humanity and giving an explanation for what goes wrong in the world, including, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Trump-supporting congressperson who retweeted something about Jewish space lasers, causing California forest fires. So all of those would come under any of the definitions, and that's fine. But the divide over the Israel-Palestine problem is one that I think those other two avoid. But the question is, what do we want to use a definition for? And I don't think any of them should be used as a hate speech code on a campus. I think they could be used for having conversations about anti-Semitism. And I think there are good ways too to point to the definition and other things to underscore one of the other problems. And this may be a good note to finish, that what I've seen is that the divide over Israel-Palestine is such that people in one camp or the other discount clear instances of anti-Semitism from people from their camp. They try to give excuses. They try to, to marginalize it, to try to homogenize it and make it disappear. And I think one of the things that's really important is to have a consistent principle when you're talking about anti-Semitism. Is it conspiracy theory about Jews? Is it harassing in that way? Is it being used in that ideological way, whether it's the left and the right? Then you speak out about it. And if you don't keep a consistent principle, and on the academy, we don't keep a consistent principle of academic freedom, regardless of which side is pushing to censor the other, you're never going to succeed in getting a correct pushback of this and maintaining what, to me, is one of the most precious jewels of our society, the academy, where you're supposed to be looking at ideas.
Indeed. And I suppose in closing, Ken, I mean, nobody could really disagree with the idea that the consistency and racism needs to be opposed wherever it raises its ugly head. And in the Israel-Palestine context, to which, of course, we're particularly interested in here at Palestine Deep Dive, there are, of course, on both the Palestinian and the Israeli side, there has been an intemperance and a refusal to accept the racism that is being meted out. So, I mean, I suppose we could end by saying that, the lesson to be learned is that it has to be opposed wherever it appears, essentially racism in all its forms is unacceptable. And also if it's being pursued by a state policies. And I think that's possibly where we should, we would probably end up agreeing, because we could look at, for instance, some of the policies that were pursued in South Africa and some of the policies that are being pursued in the occupied territories, in Israel and the occupied territories now, and see those similarities, as the UN, as Amnesty, as B'Tselem and others have done. But I mean, essentially, we really wanted to talk to you today about this whole broader issue of anti-Semitism, how to tackle it, your work that you've been engaged in over the years, and also your rather courageous stand in actually saying, well, look, some of the work that I've been engaged in has ended up being, misappropriated in a way and misused. And I think that's very, very important for people who want to try and have a measured understanding of things, and who, like all of us, are opposed to racism of all kinds, wherever it appears. So, Kenneth, I'm really very grateful for, and from all of us here at Palestine Deep Dive, thank you for joining us today from New York. Let's keep in touch, and let's hope that we'll speak again. And good luck with all the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.